What makes America so stupid? Capitalism. Why? Because capitalism is a pyramid scheme. It's a system that is immoral, unfair, inefficient, exploitative, and destructive. It's a system based on lies and ignorance, since that's the only way it can work, where most people blindly accept a system that takes advantage of them, which is why we have the big lies of capitalism pounded into our heads from a young age. So most of us never question the lies, and never question capitalism itself. We're taught capitalism is moral, and fair, and efficient. It's not. Those are lies. A system that is based on the concepts of the profit motive, greed, and obsession with wealth isn't moral, and exploiting other people and focusing only on your own self-interest goes against the morality of most major religions in the world. A system with massive inequality and too big to fail, which gives advantages to some that others don't have, and makes sure the game is always rigged, is not fair and can never be fair. A system of constant boom and bust cycles, with recessions and depressions, is not efficient. A system where large numbers of people have the desire and ability to work, but don't have jobs, is not efficient. We're taught capitalism can lift everyone up. It can't. That's a lie. In a system dominated by the need to constantly raise profits and lower production costs, capitalists always try to pay workers as little as they can get away with, which puts a limit on how many people can make a good living. And with the boom and bust cycle, there are guaranteed bad times built into capitalism, which always causes a lot of people to suffer. So capitalism can't ever lift everyone up. And the way capitalism works also means that once workers do start to make too much, capitalists outsource jobs and move production to cheaper places. Losing massive numbers of jobs and stagnant or declining wages over the past 30 years was covered up to a certain extent by cheap and easy credit and housing and financial bubbles. But now that the bubbles have burst, the problems have become pretty hard to cover up, and people are desperate and thinking the country is in decline, but with no good answers, mostly because almost no one is willing to talk about what the problem really is. Because even with the reality of a broken economy, and even after an enormous financial crisis, so many Americans are still not able to criticize capitalism. Why? Because above all, Americans are taught to think capitalism is the same thing as freedom. It's not. That's a lie. Saying phrases like free market and free enterprise all the time is a good way to brainwash and distract people from the fact that even though Americans love the ideal of freedom, they don't really have freedom under capitalism. Being able to make mostly meaningless choices isn't freedom, and we don't have democracy either. When big corporations and the wealthy control everything with a political system of legalized bribery, democracy doesn't exist. Capitalism provides freedom and democracy only to people wealthy enough to afford it. But how can all of this be true? If capitalism is such a bad system, if so many of our problems are inevitable under capitalism, why do most people seem so blind to the truth? Because we're taught to take capitalism completely for granted. We're taught not to question a system where workers produce most of the wealth, but that wealth is mostly given to those at the top. We're taught that nothing else works, but we're not taught much about any other system like socialism, other than being taught to think it's evil. We're taught to think that Europe's problems are because of socialism, even though Europe doesn't have real socialism, and much of the problems in Europe and throughout the Western world are because of capitalism. We're not taught that most of the so-called communist countries couldn't have had real communism or socialism. We're not taught that true democracy is a crucial part of accomplishing real socialism. And we're not taught that socialism is a better system that capitalism can eventually become, or that socialism is the potential built into capitalism, not just some hypothetical idea outside of capitalism. Because having too many people thinking about the possibility of socialism would be very dangerous. So most people are taught not to think too much about capitalism or socialism. In fact, most Americans are mostly taught not to think. We're put in a school system that doesn't educate us, that teaches students in ways that are mostly unimaginative and uninteresting, which doesn't make us want to learn, and doesn't give most of us the ability to think critically or really question things. We're given constant tests, which mostly just causes constant stress and destroys any desire for real learning. We structure our entire educational system around tests, the one thing we all hate, and the one thing which helps restrict any freedom teachers or students might have in deciding how and what to learn. So we don't get much of an education, but our young people are $1 trillion in debt just from going to college, and now can't find jobs that they were told they needed to go to college to get. And then after not learning much in school, we're thrown into a society of constant noise and nonsense and dishonesty and made into wage slaves. A society where the media takes capitalism completely for granted while pretending to be objective. With all the economic problems in the country and the world over the past several years, how many stories have you seen in the news about whether there are problems with capitalism? But instead of ever talking about capitalism, the media, who are owned almost entirely by a small number of profit-driven corporations, focuses mostly on nonsense and basically just adds to an already dumbed-down culture. And after going through a dysfunctional educational system and taking in the fog of constant mindless noise from our media and culture, most Americans have been trained to mindlessly accept jobs they hate, not care too much about understanding the people and world around them, and just accept things as they are. What you're left with is a country where people are either basically uninformed and don't know or care about much, or people on opposite sides who care a lot but can both never talk about the one thing that is a shared source of suffering and misery. On one side, you have liberals and Democrats who genuinely care about problems with health care and jobs and corruption and war and inequality and stagnant wages and the economy and environmental damage and education, but can't ever make the connection that issues in capitalism lie at the heart of all these problems. They usually try in vain to reform broken systems instead of replace them. They talk and act as if you can just take on this problem and then that problem. And that's why they never seem to really change anything. Or they make the connection between capitalism and most of the problems it causes, but are too afraid to ever speak up about capitalism. So they just keep settling, while telling themselves they're being pragmatic. No matter how many times liberals are disappointed by Democrats, they keep telling themselves that the lesser of two evils is the choice they have to settle for, even while problems keep getting worse and worse. Liberals want people to be kind and cooperative, want good health care and education for everyone, want less inequality, and want a planet that isn't being destroyed by profit-driven pollution. But they ignore all the ways capitalism makes all these things almost impossible. And so, because they either can't come to the conclusion that capitalism is the problem, or because they're too afraid to speak up about capitalism, liberals just keep dreaming of a better world, but won't fight to make it happen. So they settle for the Democrats, a spineless party that almost never fights for anything, almost never tries to educate people or change their minds on an issue, and takes massive amounts of campaign contributions from many of the same sources that Republicans do: Wall Street, the wealthy, and corporations. They settle for a Democratic Party that just gives in caves almost all the time, a party that almost always has trouble getting enthusiastic support, since they usually won't make the strongest and most honest argument available to them, because they're afraid of being called socialists or too liberal. So Democrats usually just go for small reforms that do almost nothing, and then try to cover up their spinelessness and ineptitude by selling themselves as being not the Republicans. Then there's the other side of the coin, with conservatives and Republicans, and their mindless devotion to the wealthy and to capitalism itself. The conservative mindset is to see everything through a lens of ideas and beliefs that sound good as long as you don't actually think about them. To talk about personal responsibility and tell people to just go find a job, while ignoring the fact that after decades of jobs leaving the country, there simply aren't enough jobs available at this point in American capitalism. To keep thinking that everyone can make it if they just work hard, when the reality is that overall productivity has gone up over the past 30 years, with workers being squeezed more and more, while average overall wages have stagnated or even gone down. To ignore that social mobility is now lower in the US than it is in places like Europe and Canada, and more than 99% of the people are not going to win the lottery or strike it rich or become the next internet billionaire. Being a conservative means to ignore everything that is wrong with capitalism and blame everyone and everything else, like liberals, Muslims, gays, black people, immigrants, Hispanics, Asians, or people with different political parties or beliefs, or the poor, or people who belong to unions, or the government. It means getting angry at immigrants instead of thinking about why there aren't enough jobs. It means seeing the number of people getting government assistance and just seeing an entitlement nation and not thinking about why almost half the country is living near poverty. It means seeing a terrible economy and thinking the whole problem is just too much regulation instead of recognizing that the big problem is that there's no demand, not understanding that when wealth becomes totally concentrated among a small number of people and the middle class disappears, there aren't enough people who can afford to buy enough stuff to keep the economy going, and then capitalism starts to eat itself. Focusing only on your own self-interest sounds nice, as long as you ignore basic morals, ignore the fact that we all live in a society, and ignore what ultimately happens under unrestrained capitalism. Just saying words like freedom or personal responsibility or entrepreneurs over and over again is not going to fix the problem if the problem is caused by the system itself. But for so many people who identify as conservative, questioning capitalism would be like questioning one of their most basic beliefs that so much of their thinking is built on. And that's not an easy thing for most human beings to do. So instead, you see many of them focusing so much of their anger and energy on government, or on the secret socialist in the White House. The guy who's probably the worst socialist of all time, since he didn't even try for a single-payer system in healthcare, and then caved on the public option, and caved on the Bush tax cuts for the rich, caved on the debt deal, and didn't break up, restructure, or nationalize the banks. Or when they're not focused on their make-believe socialist, they focus on social issues, and go along with people who are not moral, and who don't have real values or principles, while convincing themselves they're on the side of the good guys. And that's because Republicans have made selling fear and anger into a science, and using these tools of control to keep people who might otherwise be decent people so constantly angry and scared that they're willing to do whatever it takes to win the war they think they're on the right side in. Except that a side that pretends to be all about values and morals and principles, while practicing constant never-ending dishonesty and always trying to give more to those at the top while showing disdain for the poor, is not really the good guys. One of the most important ways the Republican Party has grown its power over the last 30 years is by tricking religious people into thinking that capitalism is a moral system, and getting Christians to ignore most of what the Republican Party is really about. But whether you vote for the Democrats or the Republicans, political leaders on either side who are being pulled along by puppet strings aren't going to help you much. Both Democrats and Republicans are bought and paid for, and neither side has any real solutions to fix things. Mostly because they can't even talk about what the problem really is. So instead we get constant false and silly debates, and billions of dollars of ads that are basically, this guy sucks. Well, this guy's even worse. And the media not only takes most of this nonsense seriously, they spend massive amounts of time and energy analyzing it as real news. But in a country where speaking out against capitalism is considered taboo, what person running for office has the courage to do that? Except, what if so many of our problems are because of the one thing no one is willing to talk about? Many people want to know why the economy is still so bad right now for so many of us, and why does it seem like nothing is being done to fix it? Well, a big part of why the economy is so bad is because of something that is a central part of the way capitalism works. The reality is that the goal of maximizing profits, which is a fundamental part of capitalism, eventually causes capitalists and corporations to take so many jobs out of a country like America that it leads to a struggling economy and massive unsustainable borrowing to deal with capitalism's negative effects. When more and more jobs are lost from America, workers here also have less and less power, forcing people to settle for lower wages and more difficult lives. And as fewer people belong to unions, and too many people are unemployed or don't have good-paying jobs, and wealthy capitalists take more and more of the money out of society, eventually you don't have a strong enough consumer base to keep capitalism going, and capitalism starts to eat itself. Because the problem isn't simply how many people are unemployed. It's also all the people who have a job or even two and still can't get by. All the people in a constant struggle just to pay for healthcare and school and basic human needs. So not only is it a lie that capitalism can lift everyone up, what you have now in the United States is a country where almost half the people are living at, below, or close to poverty. Many Americans may not yet realize it, but what they're seeing now is the true cost of the so-called free market. So why wouldn't the economy be bad at this point for so many Americans? After 30 years of jobs leaving the country, as America entered the fully global version of capitalism, and wages stagnating for most workers, while at the same time prices for everything keep going up. And then also adding in the bursting of the housing bubble and the devastating financial crisis. There simply aren't enough consumers with purchasing power to keep the economy going anymore. Corporations aren't sitting on $2 trillion in cash just because of uncertainty or regulations or because of the government. They're sitting on $2 trillion because there isn't enough demand. But how many people can be honest enough to say that the problems in capitalism are because of capitalism? Instead, the supposed experts talk about how the economy will gradually get better. The same experts who never seem to see major crises coming until it's already too late. Or conservatives say more tax breaks for the wealthy will somehow fix things, even though that's nonsense. We've already tried that, and that doesn't work. Or liberals think the answer is a small increase in government jobs. Most people don't want to have to think about this stuff. They just want the economy fixed. They want to have things go back to the way they were. But what if that's not possible? What if capitalism can't keep going forever, and no one is talking about that? Because Americans know they aren't supposed to question capitalism. After all, everyone knows that if you're a dirty, rotten socialist pinko, then you're evil. Because socialism and communism, those are terrible things. Except if you asked most Americans why those things are so terrible, could they really tell you, other than the fact that they know they're supposed to think that way? The idea of socialism is that the people own the means to production, an economy planned by true democracy. The point of socialism is a system based on morality, where people have access to healthcare and education, and don't have to constantly worry about basic needs being met. The goal of socialism is also a process, where workers have greater input and creativity in their work, and the nature of work itself changes. The goal of socialism is a stable, prosperous society. It's not that everyone has the same exact amount of money or the same amount of stuff. So what exactly is so evil about any of this? Or could it be that for most people to accept capitalism, they have to also be convinced that any other system is evil and won't work? So is the way things are now really how things have to be? How much longer do we have to keep accepting war and poverty and destruction of the environment? Is capitalism really the best we can do? And if you can't answer that question, or you're not sure, then ask yourself, why haven't you ever thought about capitalism? Why have Americans been trained not to think about the one thing that affects almost everything else? Why is it that you can talk about anything except for the system that runs our entire society and even affects how we act and treat each other? Is it because once you start to think about capitalism, you realize what it really is, and also what it's not? Capitalism is not moral, not fair, not efficient. It can't lift everyone up, and it's not the same thing as democracy or freedom. The more you learn about capitalism, the more you will understand why it's so important that people be brainwashed never to question it. So in a country where the word freedom is constantly used, how much freedom do Americans really have when under capitalism we seem to be free to talk about anything other than capitalism itself? So the real question is not what is making America stupid, but when will America start to wake up? What if a better world really is possible, but most people have been trained not to see how? What if all the meaningless choices people are given helps to cover up the one really important choice they're not even aware of? What if most of us never thought about something so big that it controls so many aspects of our lives? And could a better world really be possible if most people finally did start thinking about it? You don't have to keep accepting that we can't be better than we are. You don't have to keep accepting systems that push people to act badly, that work against the needs and interests of most people. A better way is possible. You can choose to stop being afraid of things you don't understand, and choose knowledge over fear and ignorance. You can choose to make a difference, even if that means changing the mind of just one person. You can choose unity over division. You can choose not to wait until things collapse before you start thinking about whether there's an answer. You can choose to stand up for what's right. You can choose to fight for a better future for yourself or for your children or grandchildren. So choose wisely, because you do have a choice.